The chime of chisels cutting into stone rose into the air over the new market quarter in the Dale of Defiance. Florine drew her fingers lightly over a slab of freshly polished sandstone half her height, her gaze wandering over the yard where dozens of hunched figures worked tirelessly into the night. Boobibi and Iliki walked beside her, their heads turning this way and that as they took in the sight. "I thought you were familiar with the Dark Dwarves," Florine said. "This is unlike what I have seen before," Boobibi said. "In the past, the Dark Dwarves used tents as you do. These dwellings of hewn stone are new, though they resemble those of the humans in Roblé." She glanced at the Dark Dwarves nearby. If they were anything like the Mountain Dwarves, they would be quick to challenge any notion that their craftsmanship could be compared to those of other races. The Xian hero's painfully loud statement was met with nothing more than the sound of continued work, however. Something doesn't seem right. More precisely, something was missing. It took her an hour of watching the Dark Dwarves work to realize what it was. To put it loosely, there was a lack of energy, no sense of joyful anticipation filled the air as it always would with the coming of a seasonal fair. All that went on around her was work. Work and more work. Or perhaps it was just her. "Leolio," she asked, "what do Maiku look like when they're happy?" Pip. He was perched on her head so she couldn't see him anyway. She turned her attention to Iliki. "What about the Yoi? How do they express their happiness?" "Why do you ask so much about happiness?" Iliki replied in a tentative tone. "Because I'd like for this to be a place where everyone can be happy," Florine said. Boobibi and Iliki stopped in their tracks. Even Leolio felt like he went deathly still. "What's wrong?" Florine asked. "A fixation on happiness is probably unwise when conveying your intent to the tribes," Boobibi said. Yaldabaoth, too, communicated his desire to deliver happiness to all. As you might guess, the results of his efforts were not well received. "Is this stupid Yaldabaoth picking a fight with me?" Even when he wasn't around anymore, Florine felt like she was being foiled by the fiend at every other turn. Within the deep wounds that he had left behind, seeds had been sown, ready to sprout up and choke any attempt at nurturing the people back to a healthy state, both physically and mentally. Florine's head bobbed slightly as Leolio hopped up onto his feet. She took a deep breath and cleared her thoughts. Just a few days had passed, yet the Maiku had already grown attentive to shifts in her mood. "How do people live from day to day with Yaldabaoth's shadow haunting them like this?" she asked. "I don't think it's a question of how," Boobibi said. "We simply do. One cannot simply just stop living." "Well, I suppose that one could, but it seems foolish. What I meant was, how do you go back to your normal lives? The lives that you had before Yaldabaoth appeared." Iliki and Boobibi exchanged a look. "You would not like that," Boobibi told her. "If I understand it correctly, you wish for us to live in peace and harmony with one another. Our lives before Yaldabaoth's appearance were far from that." "I'm afraid to ask," Florine said, "but were you satisfied with your lives back then?" "I cannot speak for the other races," Boobibi said, "but we Xian were content in our thousand sinkholes. Even so, this past life does not seem to be what you wish for." As with the tribes she had visited so far and what little detail she had on the others, that life consisted of defending their territory and competing over resources. Of course, nearby competitors were also considered resources, as many of the races in the Abelian Hills ate each other. Going by the accounts of the Xian, small empires were carved out all over the region where strong tribes surrounded themselves with dozens of lesser tribes which were raided for food and valuables. As strange as it seemed, those strong tribes fought other strong tribes over who got to eat the weaker tribes, which meant that the weak tribes were only in danger of being wiped out by random monsters or lawless marauders. Much like humans, the demi-humans innovated solutions, developing social constructs based on their way of doing things. If one considered it as a form of societal evolution, the advanced raiding that one might see in the Abelian Hills or what used to happen in the Draconic Kingdom was the equivalent of an informal tributary system drawn from the raid-centered foundations of the local tribal cultures. It allowed powerful tribes to leverage extraterritorial resources many times beyond their ability to directly control by feeding off of the populations that managed them. A careless glance might lead many to the conclusion that the practice could be used as an avenue to introduce a system of taxation, but it was an overly simplistic view. Two fundamental issues lay with seeing it that way. The first was the economic reality of the type of tribal society that they were dealing with. Industry was simple, intermittent, and lacking the consistency or scale at which it might be relied upon for revenue. Tax collectors would not be met by reluctance or defiance, but confusion, as the people didn't have any concept of taxes. Secondly was the fact that tribute implied certain things, regardless of race. It was just as much a political statement as it was about collecting riches. Conquered peoples offered tribute, as the tribes north of Irantal initially did. There were also instances where lopsided power relationships encouraged weaker parties to voluntarily offer payment for protection. While it couldn't be helped that things went the way that they did upon the Sorceress Kingdom's sudden appearance and assumption of power, the sooner proper order was established, the better. Citizens were not tributaries, nor were the people supposed to be swept up in some nation-sized protection racket. In general, the legislation of the realm had to be implemented in a way that the various races of the Sorceress Kingdom could genuinely understand and accept. Proper rule needed to replace the piece of the sword. In that case, Florine said, let's focus on matters of administration. How do you decide on your laws and policies? How were those laws and policies enforced and carried out? The Xion have no need for laws amongst ourselves, Boo Bibi replied. As for policies, what goes on inside the hive dictates what happens outside of it. King BBC spoke at length about how Xion hives functioned, but she didn't consider that it would define the entirety of how they were governed. While each possessed their own unique personality, the race of social insectoids tended to refer to themselves as parts of the hive rather than individuals who dwelled within it. Xion society revolved around the health of the hive as a whole, which could be divided into several distinct aspects. Those aspects were the same, yet different from those that could be found in human society. The, literally, central aspect was that of reproduction, which revolved around the incredibly low ratio of males to females in the Xion race. Even before Yaldabaoth had killed every male but BBC, there were several thousand females for every male. Each male was born a royal in a sense far different from human recognition. They were, for lack of a better word, breeding royalty-individuals upon which the existence of the entire species hinged. Though they had a king, they had no kingdom. There was no system of legislation, nor anything resembling an aristocracy. As Xion hive grew to the limit of what its territory could sustain and reproduction only happened to sustain the population at that limit. Everything was subtly regulated through an unfathomable interplay of sense that elements of the hive and each individual Xion gave off. Criminal behavior, which amounted to actions that intentionally harmed the hive, was unthinkable. King BBC provided an example of how it worked, explaining hunger as a scent which communicated the need to gather food to the hive. Hunters would similarly emit scents signifying degrees of success. If hunters could find enough food to satiate the hive, that scent of satiety would encourage breeding behavior. Eggs would be laid and the cycle would continue until hunters couldn't find enough food within range of the hive and a different scent would put an end to egg production and the excess eggs were consumed. As such, the size of the hive in the 1,000 sinkholes had remained the same for time immemorial. The tribes of the Abelian Hills had long learned to leave the Xion alone because waging war with them created a breeding frenzy where the depopulation of the hive combined with the availability of food through warfare created a massive spike in the Xion population and the resulting backlash. Since attacking the hive itself proved an impossible challenge for the neighboring tribes, attacking the Xion only meant that the attacker was making themselves vulnerable to attack by their own neighbors. Considering what she knew, Florine felt that she was presented with two options when it came to the Xion's inclusion into the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The first was to simply leave them be, allowing the self-regulating behavior of Xion hives to keep them where they were. She didn't like that option much as it meant that they would forever be apart from the rest of the Sorceress Kingdom's greater society. Unfortunately, finding a way for them to fit into the Sorceress Kingdom presented all sorts of potential problems. This was due to the seemingly involuntary system of sense that dictated the different aspects of Xion biology and thus was central to their society. If, for instance, she managed to raise the first ever Xion merchant, how would that merchant interact with the rest of the hive? First of all, they didn't value money in the slightest, so it would be impossible for the merchant to send any imports to them. Selling anything to the hive was naturally abhorrent to individual Xion because it was essentially taking from the hive unnecessarily. An apparent solution to the problem seemed simple enough, which was to have the hive itself act as a domain or chartered company. If the aforementioned Xian merchant could work with the hive to come up with exports that were valuable enough to create a trade surplus, then they could import food, the only commodity that they valued. That was how it would work if the Xian were humans, at least. Since everything is related to one's function in the hive, Florian said, would there be room for such a thing as a Xian merchant? I do not know what that would smell like, Vu Bibi replied. Is having a scent associated with one's activities necessary? Florian asked. Not strictly, Vu Bibi answered. We can communicate with other races who cannot discern the meaning of smells, after all. It does mean much for the Xian, however. This is hard to explain. Do humans have nothing like this? I've heard other races claim that they can smell the state of humans before, Florian said. Between humans, however, we have body language, I guess. There's also the tone of one's voice and a few other things. Bu Bibi's long arms went back and forth as she idly groomed her shiny blue carapace, an expression of thought amongst the Xian. No, what you mentioned also exists amongst the Xian. If there is no equivalent, think of it as communicating without intent. Communicating without intent? Yes. One may speak, but the words have nothing to accompany them. The expression is incomplete. This can't be helped when communicating with other races, but it would be eerie and uncomfortable between Xian. Enough to make being a merchant impossible? I will not say that anything is impossible, but they would not be very content with their lives. Something would always be missing and their fellows will always think something is wrong. Then what if we associate it with an activity that already exists? Florian asked. For example, a successful merchant would be something like a gatherer returning to the hive with resources. Would they give off the same smell, if so? The Xian hero's grooming stopped, as did her steps. She turned her long head to look up at Florian, which offered Florian a clear view of the maggot-like maw below two sharp hooks near the front of her head. I think what you are suggesting is dangerous, Bu Bibi said. Why is that? From what you said and what I have seen of human merchants in the Holy Kingdom, their place is to move resources from one location to another? From one market to another, yes, Florian said. I don't know if this means anything to you, but merchants don't move things around as laborers might. They identify differences in value for goods between one location and another. A merchant will trade those goods between locations and retain the difference. This difference is called profit. This feels too complicated. Bu Bibi turned her head toward the ground. Furthermore, some of what you say makes no sense to me. If one trades enough food to feed themselves for a day, why would one get more than that in return? Is that where we're starting from? The tribes that she had dealt with up until this point were much easier to communicate trade-related concepts to, but they were more human-like when it came to how they perceived the world. Hopefully, this sort of ignorance would be limited to the Xian and other races with similarly insular societies. Because different people have different valuations on the same resources, Florian said. For instance, ore-bearing rocks may not have any value to the Xian, but races capable of metalworking would be willing to exchange those rocks for food. Plants that grow in your territory may not be edible to you, but they may be to others, and thus one can turn a profit from trading them. This is one of the most basic forms of commerce. Raw resources are extracted and exchanged for other resources that can't otherwise be obtained. So these Xian merchants would go out into the world and function as gatherers do. Bu Bibi resumed walking, except that they are bringing back food from the rest of the world. Yes, that's right, Florian smiled. As I thought, the suggestion is dangerous. Her smile vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. Why? Nations do their best to ensure the safety of merchants. Trade is a way to peacefully exchange resources between parties that may otherwise feel compelled to fight over them. But those resources must come from somewhere, Bu Bibi said. When Yaldabaoth invaded Roble, we saw firsthand what humans did to produce food. They grew crops and orchards or raised livestock in pastures. You say that we may trade for food, but is the land used to produce that food not limited? No matter how much of this profit a merchant may make, it cannot be used to purchase what does not exist. The activity of merchants tends to bring two markets to equilibrium, Florian replied. At some point, a trade route won't be profitable anymore. Things don't always stay the same, but merchants tend to have to keep searching for the best routes to ply. Assuming that this works for the Xian, the activity of these Xian merchants will ultimately always bring food to the hive, Bu Bibi said. They do not even need to exchange resources from our territory, they will be able to profit from trade wherever they go. All of these profits become food, which leads to more eggs being laid and more Xian encouraged to become merchants, as they are the most successful gatherers. If our merchants are allowed to gather from the entire world, then the hive will grow to colossal size. As well-meaning as you seem to be, I do not think that anyone would allow this. Well, you would be limited by the extent of your territory, Florine said. It is a lot of territory, Boo Bibi told her. Overlanders cannot grasp how much room there is underground. Can the world feed billions of Xian? What will the Sorcerer's Kingdom do if our expansion into the earth brings us into conflict with the realms below? She didn't have an answer to either question. The projections for population growth raised eyebrows from people like Ludmilla, but they weren't so extreme that Florine thought them impossible to work with. Available space was the biggest limit to growth, but all subterranean races like the Xian and Quagga had to do was dig deeper into areas that weren't occupied by anyone. Many races could live underground just as well as they could live above ground, as well. Amongst them, goblins were identified as the most problematic species, with their highly fecund nature and ability to adapt to life pretty much anywhere. The protection provided by the Sorcerer's Kingdom meant that the old, predatory relationships between the various races in the region no longer kept any population in check. In their stead were economic pressures, but the notion that individuals were highly likely to favor their own race led to a highly unfavorable situation for any that couldn't keep up in terms of collective economic potential. How the Sorcerer's Kingdom would handle the looming problem was a puzzle that seemed to have no solution other than to limit growth. As for the latter question, I've heard the realms below mentioned in passing a few times, Florine said, but I don't know what it is, exactly. It should be as it sounds, Boo Bibi replied. I do not think that the term should have come out strangely. It is the same thing to all overlanders, the lands below, the lands above. How frequently do you come into contact with the people living in the realms below? Florine asked. We are only aware of their existence, Boo Bibi answered. There is a great flow that divides us, one that runs under the mountains from the sea to the west. Can't you go around it? Rivers below are not like the rivers that one sees above ground, Boo Bibi told her. The Great Flow is probably hundreds of kilometers wide, seeping through faults and porous rock. It is not so much a matter of going around it as finding a place where one can go through it. As far as I know, the only point of access is at the Great Falls, but the realms below are reputed to be so dangerous that none dare venture there. Not even you? Boo Bibi let out a short laugh. There are places above the Great Flow that are too dangerous for even heroes to tread, she said. Trying to go any deeper is unthinkable. If we had far more Xian than we currently have, however, well, quantity has a quality all of its own, and individual Xian are not exactly weak. I don't understand why you have to be so warlike in your thinking, Florine sighed. As far as I know, Boo Bibi said, conflict is more common than peace. I know of no one who has gone through the same effort as you to do what you are trying to do. The humans that we fought with in Roblé only saw our cooperation as a means to an end. Our relationship with them ended as soon as we left. King BBC suggested as much during her time in the Thousand Sinkholes, but was that truly the case? Could people who experienced the same, harrowing war that Yaldabaoth brought upon the region so simply go their separate ways? While the isolationist nature of the Xian did tend towards them allowing any relationships that they had with outsiders to drift apart, Florine couldn't imagine Roblé doing the same thing. No matter their underlying motives, nobles tended to leverage their connections as much as possible, so she couldn't imagine that the Holy Kingdom's aristocrats could disregard their new relationship with the Xian so easily. Maybe I should bring some Xian over to the Holy Kingdom and see what happens. Was she allowed to do that? Promoting amicable relations between the citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom and the Holy Kingdom of Roblé wasn't out of line with national policy. Once things were a bit better sorted out in the Abelian Hills, she would have to give it a try. It would help immensely if they weren't simply just visiting and brought something of value to the table. Ahead of them, Falagrim and a few of his subordinates rose from their places around a campfire at Florine's approach. What is it? Falagrim said. Despite his curt reception, Florine put on a warm smile. Falagrim's frown only deepened in response, almost looking as if his entire beard was frowning along with him. I should introduce this guy to Ludmilla. They could have a frowning contest. I just came to see how you and your people are doing, Florine said. Thank you for being so prompt and thorough with your cooperation, by the way. Did you expect something else? Phalagram asked. I didn't have any expectations, Florine answered. Since it seemed that you didn't like being compared to the mountain dwarves, I'm doing my best to shed any preconceptions that I may have developed. The dark dwarf snorted and sat back down. Florine took several steps forward, savoring the warmth of the fire after strolling in the chilly night wind. Honestly, she had no idea what he liked aside from slaves. It felt like he took offense at everything. He obviously hadn't had a change of heart since agreeing to cooperate with her, but she still hadn't developed any sense of what his motives were. The fact that the dark dwarves seemed to throw themselves into their task was surprising, to say the least. I heard that this wasn't the usual way that you set things up, Florine said. You said that you wanted something permanent. Yes, that's right. I appreciate that you've even sized them for the different races that will come here. Did you have a question? Florine glanced over the semicircle of bearded faces looking up at her. Maybe brusque grumpiness was a racial trait. Despite their apparent zeal over construction work, Florine said, the construction crews don't seem very pleased. Might I inquire as to the relationship you have with these gentlemen? Phalagram exchanged looks with the other dark dwarves at the campfire, then his gaze went to the construction crews toiling away in the darkness. After a moment, his attention slowly returned to Florine. They're laborers, he said. Why does it matter whether they're pleased? Well, this is supposed to be a market. Aren't markets supposed to be a bit more upbeat? A low grunting sound rose from the dark dwarf's throat. It took her a moment to realize that Phalagram was chuckling. Even then, he didn't smile. I see. You did say that it was going to be a market. Shall we liven things up a bit, then? Enough to make a dark dwarf smile? Phalagram's gauntlet went to the heavy whip on his hip. The corner of Florine's lip turned downward. I was merely ensuring that your employees weren't being mistreated, Master Phalagram, she said. On that note, you needn't focus on the marketplace and visitors' accommodations first. I won't think poorly of you if you built dwellings for yourself and your people. That's not what we're here to do, Phalagram replied. Here's a piece of advice for you, girl. Dark dwarves don't do happy. Well, I suppose that Yeldermouth fellow had his own brand of happiness going on. That wasn't so bad at all. Leolio stood with a ruffle of his feathers as Florine's hands balled up into fists. I can't understand how you could do business with that vile fiend, she said. He had an army to equip and he paid on time with no fuss, Phalagram said. An excellent merchant such as yourself should have no problems understanding why that's a good thing. Why did I expect any better from a slave trader? At least he wouldn't be able to perpetrate his evil from now on. Not in the Sorceress Kingdom, at least. Lady Gagne. She turned at the sound of Isaraku's voice. One of his juniors from the administration had come to join him. What's the matter? She asked. A volatile situation has developed near the western border, Isaraku answered. Florine froze, her stomach dropping with a queasy feeling. The western border, which part of the western border? A section along the buffer zone between the Sorceress Kingdom and the Holy Kingdom of Roble, the Elder Lich replied. No. I just got here. This can't happen yet. Prepare my escort, Florine said. We leave at once. It's spite. It has to be. Florine cast a sidelong glance at the pair of dark dwarves riding the Solita next to her. The two were desperately clutching at the thing as they galloped somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 kilometers an hour over the arid plains along the Abelian River. She imagined that not many terrestrial beings had ever traveled so fast, yet Phalagram and his cleric, Agni, supposedly his sister-in-law, still wore the same dour expressions as always. What are you looking at? Phalagram said. Nothing. Florine looked away. What's that supposed to mean? She held in a sigh. The Dark Dwarf Prince insisted on coming along, wanting to see how the Sorceress Kingdom handled things. For her part, Florine was riding with Bubibi in front of her. Xion were roughly the size of human children, so she was an easy fit. The vampire bride hugged Florine from behind. Iliki stayed behind to sleep in the tunnel that she had dug under her tent. Plus there's a bird on my head and a demon in my shadow. And, then, there's Isaraku. The Elder Lich was using a fly spell while holding onto the Solita's tail since flight magic alone wasn't anywhere near as fast. Florian was certain that any demi-humans who saw them whiz by would do so with expressions agog, but there seemed to be none along the way. While humans might settle to cultivate lands in river valleys, demi-humans prioritized finding places with good natural defenses against raiders, magical beasts, and the occasional monster. Though none of those existed any longer between Yaldabaoth's brief reign of terror and the Sorceress Kingdom's annexation of the area, a mix of tradition and practicality still had the local tribes stick fast to their old ways. Those old ways were potentially a boon and a burden at the same time. They were invaluable at providing insights into each tribe and its workings, yet she never knew when she would accidentally trip over something problematic. Then there was the volatile situation developing along the western border, which threatened to provoke the Sorceress Kingdom's new citizens into their old practices. They reached the Abelian estuary roughly an hour and a half after departing the Dale of Defiance. From there, the Soul Eaters slowed down as they followed the sandy coastline north. Their journey took them over a small, rocky peninsula with a narrow cove on the other side. A pair of Death Knights met them on the beach near a large cluster of high tents. The two undead patrollers brought their fists up to their breastplates in a stiff salute before one of them gestured to the settlement beyond. Representatives from the local tribes have gathered here with their concerns, Isaraku said. That doesn't seem normal. Florian peered at the distant bonfire in the darkness. I thought every tribe has been keeping to themselves since the king's peace was declared. We believe that they tracked down the patrol with their rangers, the Elder Lich said. This merely happens to be the location where they were intercepted by the first set of petitioners. Have there been any new developments since we departed? No. That was a good sign, at least. Isaraku's alarming report back in the Dale of Defiance did suggest a volatile situation in development, but, thus far, any sparks that might set things aflame hadn't happened yet. Perhaps the most annoying part about it was that the undead patrols had no sense for what was going on. Things either were or weren't threats, and threats that took action were dealt with accordingly. Things had gotten to a near untenable point before the tribes sent their petitioners, probably as a last resort. The undead couldn't identify issues that couldn't be stabbed, and the tribes were unaccustomed to communicating in a non-violent way with anyone, never mind the undead. In the meantime, a seemingly endless variety of problems didn't wait for Florian's plans to address that. She stopped her Soul Eater a good distance from the perimeter of the settlement and let Bubibi down before dismounting. Roughly halfway to the first circle of tents, several figures emerged at the edge of her dark vision. According to her materials, 7 different races of demi-humans once lived along the western coast. By the time the Sorcerer King liberated the Abelian Hills, the only one that remained was the Monachini. They were a race of Azarashi beastmen, whatever an Azarashi was. The demi-humans standing before her had cute dog-like heads and sleek coats of short brown fur. They also stood as tall as Death Knights, carrying barbed bone spears half again their height. The undead said that our new ruler was on her way, one of them said with a harsh, guttural voice. Is that you? The demi-humans' gazes were directed at Isaraku rather than Florian. The Elder Lich cleared its throat and gestured toward her. You? The group's speaker said in suspicious tones. Me, Florian smiled back. I believe representatives from several tribes have gathered. Might you be so kind as to guide me to them? The demi-humans exchanged glances before turning and walking back into the camp. Their flippered feet kicked up sand as they waddled along, but those showered along the way paid no mind. Instead, they stared at Florian and her party with their large, dark eyes. On second thought, Bubibi said, maybe I should have stayed in the Dale of Defiance. Why is that? Florian asked. Xian. A voice cried from the darkness nearby. Why have you come, Xian? Your foul kind is not welcome here. A sudden wave of hostility swept over her. All around them, hundreds of demi-humans filled the spaces between the tents. Their previously cute, dog-like faces pulled back into snarls, revealing long fangs that gleamed in the moonlight. Begone, Xian. Take your new human wench with you. Eh? How did I get dragged into this? Filthy friend of the fishman. Go drown yourself. The crowd pressed in as they hurled more insults. They took several steps back as Leolio hopped to his feet, letting out a threatening pip. Eventually, Florian arrived at the bonfire she had spotted from where she dismounted. In addition to the race populating the settlement, there were 2 other groups. One was made up of reptilian demi-humans that vaguely looked like lizardmen. Unlike the lizardmen, however, they didn't have webbed feet and were quite a bit thinner. Sandy scales covered them from head to toe and their heads ended in short, beaked mouths. For some reason, she felt that they were no happier to see Boo Bibi than the Monachini. The other race looked like a collection of sticks pieced together into an insectoid form. They leaned back and forth in unison as if they were swaying in the wind. Florine had no idea how to read them at all. On the opposite side of the bonfire, a Monachini rose to its feet, layers of shell necklaces rattling as it did. "I didn't want to believe it," the demi-human said in a vaguely female voice. "But it is true. Have you come to add to our woes, Zien? I had hoped never to see another one of your kind for the rest of my life." "Or ever again," the reptilian spat. The twig insectoids only stared silently at Boo Bibi, a malevolent feeling emanating from each. Angry voices drifted in from the darkness all around them. Florine regarded the Xion hero with a slight frown. "I'm afraid that I lack the context for this," she said. "The Xion raided us." The brown-furred demi-human shouted, "Raided us with no just cause. Their stinking holes are 100 kilometers away and still they came and killed." "Is that true?" Florine asked. "That was around 20 years ago," Boo Bibi said. "We came for a certain lord. Your people killed him." Froth flew from the Monkini's mouth. "We never presented any threat to the Xion. Your people came and killed him, and because you killed him we could no longer hold against the merfolk. So many starved and died. Our people dwindled to a quarter of what once was. Your people quadrupled their population under that lord's leadership," Boo Bibi noted. It appeared that they had been targeted by one of the preemptive strikes that Boo Bibi had mentioned. Despite rarely being attacked, the Xion still manipulated the balance of power in the region just in case. "Also," Boo Bibi added, "it wasn't my people who killed him, it was me." Deathly silence fell over the crowd. Florine wanted to cover her face with a palm. The brown-furred demi-human tottered on her feet. You're Boo Bibi." Fearful whispers rose from all around them, rapidly becoming panicked cries. "Boo Bibi. Boo Bibi. The purple lighting has come to strike us again." Many demi-humans receded into the shadows. More still surged forward with angry voices. "Smash her shell. Fillet her. We need more rocks. Enough." The night fell still again. Florine stepped into the light of the bonfire. "It would be unreasonable for me to ask for everyone to forget the past," Florine said. "However, I am here to address your present problems. Who speaks for the tribes represented here?" "Urforu," the necklaced Monachini said. "Elder of the barbed urchin tribe." Tikokl, one of the reptilians, stepped forward. "Headhunter of the Klixikar clan." ZZTZTL, headhunter of the DRTHR. She nodded to each in turn. "Thank you for taking the time to bring your concerns to the administration. I am Florine Cadia Dale-Gonye, a baroness of the Sorceress Kingdom. Though this may be the source of some confusion, I have not been sent to rule you, but to assist in administering the Abelian wilderness. In time, you will come to understand what this means." "Ha, I cheated." She wanted to avoid using any of her old tricks, but the discourse went flying in an unexpected direction and only became worse with every moment. With what was at risk, it was hardly the time for experimentation. "Now," Florine said, "I believe you have petitions to make and they're all related to the same problem." Urforu let out a sigh that reeked of fish. "They are one and the same, but your arrival has dashed away our hopes." "Why is that?" "Because it is a problem with humans," Urforu told her. "Why would one send a human to deal with humans? It is obvious that you will take your race's side. Humans would sooner kill us than act reasonably." "They're not my people," Florine replied coolly. "I hail from the other side of the Abelian wilderness, from a different country entirely where none of the races of the tribes represented here exist. I'm unaware of any specific history that you may have with the Holy Kingdom of Roble. You should start by explaining what's going on here." The Monachini elder slumped back onto the driftwood log in front of the bonfire. Florine held her gaze until she seemed to relent. "Our people lived in several colonies along the coast before Yaldabaoth came," Urforu said. "The humans across the bayside with the merfolk, which makes them our enemies. Am I correct in assuming that the source of this enmity is competition over territory and resources?" "Yes and no. The source is indeed as you say, but things have gone beyond competition. They are truly enemies of our people. But weren't you part of the Sorcerer King's forces when he returned from the Abelian Hills to liberate Roble? Florine asked. We did not come to save the humans and the merfolk, Urforu said. We came to help defeat Yaldabaoth and his minions. The legends make it clear that all must stand together to fight great evils when they arise. One could also say that events such as these are an opportunity to forge new bonds with old enemies. Urforu made a noise somewhere between a bark and a burp. There may be wisdom in what you say, but the merfolk and the humans have simply resumed their actions as our enemies. The Sorceress Kingdom may wish for peace, but peace was never an option. How can that be? Florine frowned. The Sorceress Kingdom and the Holy Kingdom of Roble are supposed to be on good terms. There have been no reports of conflict anywhere along the border. This peace only works to Roble's advantage. Urforu bore her fangs. We live at the end of the bay. Because we are prohibited from fighting, all the merfolk need to do is drive the fish away. It is the act of an enemy that wishes for nothing but the death of our people. It is the same on land, Teacock added. The prohibition on raiding and all forms of violent warfare have encouraged many human tribes to expand beyond their wall, assured that they will meet with no retaliation for their actions. They shouldn't be able to expand very far, Florine said. We have that buffer zone between us, after all. The Klixaka hunter let out a long sigh. You say that you are not the same as they, Florine Cadia Dale Gonye, he said, but your words tell a different tale. Changing one thing changes all things, and the humans of Roble bring many changes with them. The tribes saw wisdom in the establishment of this buffer zone, but it can only work if both sides respect it. So you're saying that the other side isn't? Florine looked over at Isoroku. Is there any evidence that we can use to support this claim? Patrols have noted no incursions into the specified area, Isoroku said. However, it should be noted that our political stance with the Holy Kingdom of Roble means that not every possible resource has been brought to bear. You have some resources right here, Florine gestured to the tribal representatives. Can you take us to where these problems are occurring? We can do this, ZZTZTL trilled. Does this mean that something can be done? I can only promise that any unlawful activities will be addressed, Florine replied. If we discover any that effectively circumvent the law to facilitate undesirable outcomes, I will consult with the central administration for an acceptable resolution. An uneasy feeling fell over Florine as she was led on foot out of the settlement and further west along the coast. The western border was far more lush than the interior. Thick brush obstructed her view of the landscape, making her constantly wonder if something would suddenly pop up and attack them. So you mentioned something about human tribes expanding beyond the wall, Florine said. What is it that they're doing? It is similar to what we witnessed when the Sorcerer King led us beyond the wall, Teacockle said. All is being stripped away, replaced by vast seas of grass. That should mean they're clearing the frontier for farmland, Florine said. But our patrols should have noticed if they're cutting into the buffer zone. They have not done this, yet. The ways of humans are strange, they turn the land into squares. We cannot tell where they will go next, but we can already see the damage being done. But if they're not infringing on the buffer zone, we have no right to stop them. The hunters ahead of them ducked as the animal trail they were following turned into a veritable tunnel of vegetation. Florine slowed down, careful not to accidentally lose Leolio on a low-hanging branch. Is this how humans do things? Teacockle said. My people lived in the savannah to the south before being moved here, so our experience with your kind is limited. It feels as if humans believe that they can decide what is and what isn't. A border is a line. The land is turned into squares. But the world does not work like that. The squares are plots, Florine said. I don't know how they do things here, but, where I come from, the lines are drawn in respect to natural features. Plots are allocations of land that come with contracts of tenancy. They're places where people can make a living for themselves. The reason that they look like squares is because it's a simple way to organize things. A village is built amidst a collection of plots. Anywhere between 5 and 10 villages will form what is called a barony, which is managed by a human lord. A barony is ruled by a baron or a baroness. And you are a baroness. That's right. So this barony is basically a tribe? In terms of relationships between people, I'd say that each village is something like a tribe. Tribes usually have chiefs, but they're not the same as human lords. Cockle looked over his shoulder at her. You do not look strong enough to rule over multiple tribes, or even one, for that matter. Humans have different types of lords, Florine said. The strong type of lord that you're accustomed to tends to protect the borderlands while ones like me administer the tribes in safer territories. Is there such a thing? All territory can be dangerous, and strength can steal everything without strength to counter it. From what I've seen, the way we humans do things results in higher populations than the average demi-human tribe. Rather than fight every battle personally, human lords like myself instead have soldiers to maintain security. Human countries raise large armies in this fashion. We have seen these soldiers, ZZTZTL said from behind her. Few were notably strong. A single Zoroaster could probably kill several thousand in a single battle. A Zoroaster tribe on the warpath would have easily destroyed most of their army if not for the aid of the Sorcerer King. She didn't have a suitable answer for that. When it came to the greater scheme of things, even humans themselves recognized that they were somewhere at the bottom of the pile when it came to raw martial power. A great deal of investment was required to train, equip, and maintain a fighting standard that many demi-humans enjoyed by simply existing. Well, there's always someone stronger, Florine said. I won't pretend that humans can fight everything and win. We must do what we can to survive. This is true, Cockle nodded. ZZTZTL was using an unfair example anyway. There is no such thing as an unfair example in this case, ZZTZTL replied. All it takes is something to happen once to end the legacy of generations, be it Zoroaster, dragons, or demon gods. Shut your maws, a voice hissed from ahead of them. We approach the human lands. The gurgling of a stream filtered through the leaves and their party stopped just before the vegetation abruptly ended. From the shelter of the brush, Florine saw hundreds of men toiling away across the water, uprooting stumps and clearing boulders. Women and children did lighter work, sorting the leavings strewn over the cleared lands into different piles awaiting transport. For some reason, the Holy Kingdom of Roble declined the use of undead labor despite the Sorceress Kingdom's role in their war, so the 10-kilometer-wide strip of land between the buffer zone and the Great Wall of Roble was nowhere close to being completely cleared. The narrow length that they saw was likely cleared first to mark the limit of available land. At the thought of the wall, her eyes were drawn to the horizon where an unnaturally straight line interrupted by broken towers lay. Near the southern end was a fortress that she could clearly tell had been destroyed despite being so distant. The sight was a bit disappointing. Roble's Great Wall was always spoken of as an awe-inspiring thing. If this is the southern end, then the Kalinsha Gate should be 50 kilometers north of here. Why are they working so far? Further south, she spotted tall masts along the coast. That made sense. It was far easier to move cargo by ship than it was by land. Do you see the problem now? Cockle asked. Florine's attention turned back to the workers, identifying their various tasks and how they were being organized. As far as she could tell, nothing was amiss. I believe that you and I see different things, Florine answered. What is it that you see? The reduction of game and the withering of these lands, Cockle told her. As I said, changing one thing changes all things and these humans change many things. The results are beyond our ability to predict and they will not respect your borders. The destruction wrought here will affect all of the tribes living in the west. The Abelian hills will be diminished. Water will be a problem first, ZZTZTL added. Many creeks and streams are used to mark the border. Most of those wind their way back and forth until they join the river that spills into the sea near the Monachini village. Our lands depend on those waterways and the humans are taking the water. As if on cue, a thin, middle-aged woman with sallow cheeks approached the stream with 2 wooden buckets. She set them down on the muddy shore and scanned the surroundings with a fearful gaze. Her blue eyes stopped when they met with Florine's own. Hello, Florine smiled and waved. The woman let out a piercing shriek. Her buckets came flying at Florine, but they didn't make it all the way. Raid. The woman nearly tripped over her ankles as she turned and ran away. Raid. Demi-humans. The gods save us. Her warning was picked up and repeated by the laborers in the clearing. Everyone dropped what they were doing and Florine watched with morbid curiosity as a wave of human bodies rolled straight toward the distant wall. Screams of panic and terror quickly drowned out any coherent cries. What are they doing? ZZTZTL said. I am certain that this human was too weak to detect us. Being raided, I suppose, Florine replied absently. They behave as a herd of prey animals. The insectoid demi-human cleaned his forelegs. It makes me want to chase after them. Perhaps we should leave. T. Cockle gave ZZTZTL a pointed look. Blame will be cast upon us for something we never did. I'm right here, you know. Florine rolled her eyes. We have Isoroku and the other undead back there, too. That may be so, but, considering this reaction, any warriors that respond to the raid may attack us regardless. Florine couldn't dismiss the possibility. After a moment's thought, she decided that they should stay. It's best to clear the misunderstanding with the local authorities once they arrive, she said. This isn't an incident we should leave up in the air. The two demi-humans turned their heads up at the clear morning sky. That was a figure of speech. I meant that we shouldn't allow this event to be left to their interpretation. If a woman waving from the bushes was perceived as a demi-human raid that created a mass panic that swept up all of the laborers from the border to the Great Wall, Lady Albedo might very well end up receiving a desperate plea from Hobans requesting aid against the second coming of Yaldabaoth. The day grew brighter as they waited for a response from the local authorities, but an hour passed and still no one came. Florine passed the time considering the demi-human's plight and asking various questions. It didn't take her long to develop a clearer picture of what was going on and why. Originally, the concept of the buffer zone with Roble was based on the one established between the Sorceress Kingdom and Riestize. It worked there because Riestize's fringe territories were always poorly developed and the additional presence of the evil kingdom next door encouraged people to stay away. Thus, the buffer zone was far larger than it looked as the nearby territories of Riestize had become neglected and allowed to grow wild. Roble, on the other hand, had become emboldened by the notion that the lands east of their wall had become safe. This led to their royal court dispatching pioneers to tame them. In short, the buffer zone needed to be larger in order to cushion the effects of human industrial development. It occurred to her that the former point of equilibrium was probably the wall itself and Roble should have never sent out pioneers in the first place. She wasn't sure how the new borders had been negotiated or the rationale behind it, but the Sorceress Kingdom had agreed to them to the detriment of its new citizens. There is one thing that I cannot understand no matter how I look at it, ZZTZTL said. The tribes of the Abelian Hills suffered grievously at the hands of Yaldabaoth. Should it not be the same for Roble? They did, Florine replied. According to the official report handed down to the House of Lords, the Holy Kingdom of Roble lost over a third of its population. Nearly 2 million people died and up to 1 million more were expected to perish from exposure, starvation and disease in the aftermath. We unanimously voted to provide humanitarian aid in order to mitigate this tragedy. It was a pivotal moment in the Sorceress Kingdom's history, by Florine's estimation, the point when the House of Lords went from being the nobles of an annexed territory to the legislative body of a new state determined to make its mark upon the world. According to Clara, Lady Albedo was pleased that something related to their efforts in the West was actually working for once. What is the House of Lords? ZZTZTL asked. Oh, it's a council of the Sorceress Kingdom's many lords, Florine answered. Together, with the executive branch, the royal court, they work to run the country, discussing the challenges that face the Sorceress Kingdom and putting together legislation to address those challenges. We were not aware of this, T. Cockle said. It's something inherited from the previous administration, Florine told them, so it's made up of humans at the moment. We'd like to bring in the other lords of the realm so they can offer their perspectives, but it's a long learning process. That's actually a part of the reason why I'm here. But I've only come across one lord so far and he never leaves home. Hopefully, in the future, the inclusion of leaders from many races will help us avoid oversights like the one you're presently experiencing. You helped create this? I was actually away in another country with a few others when it happened, Florine said. As far as I know, it was rolled into the end of war negotiations and the House of Lords only got to review it. It's difficult to grasp what's going on when all one has is a piece of paper. A cautionary pip from Iliolio drew her attention back to the clearing across the stream. In the distance, tall banners displaying the sigil of the Holy Kingdom of Roble and several unknown ones fluttered in the wind. Florine had the vampire bride help fix her appearance as they approached, but when she was done, it didn't look like that had come any closer. What's going on? She asked. They stopped, ZZTZTL said. A single human with a spear is making its way forward. Florian peered at the distant banners. They must have been over a kilometer away. Given their long and violent history with the tribes of the Abelian Hills, their caution probably felt warranted, but it seemed silly from her perspective. It took a full half-hour for a man dressed in the colors of Roblay's army to cautiously make his way closer to the stream. His eyes grew wide as he took in the sight of Florian and her companions on the opposite shore. Several seconds passed before he broke out of his trance and ran back the way he came. "Now that I've seen how these other humans behave," T. Cockle said, "the claim that you are a lord is not so unbelievable." "I'd rather you not use these particular humans as the standard," Florian sighed. The banners started moving again, bobbing up and down as a squadron of riders came forward at a gallop, lances leveled in a threatening display. The one at their head was adorned in gleaming steel plate, while the others appeared more sensibly dressed for patrol duties in their mail shirts and leather leggings. "You savages!" the plated leader thundered. "How dare you take a noblewoman hostage?